Log entry. Humans are classified as primitive, low efficiency, high emotional instability. That was the last thing Lyra Vey Nari recorded before her ship fell out of the sky. The impact didn't come as an explosion, just a violent silence. Metal screaming as systems died one by one, leaving only the hollow groan of a broken vessel sinking into a frozen desert where the temperature hovered at -40 degrees Fahrenheit and the air itself felt sharp enough to cut. She tasted iron and static as her biointerface flickered, her iridescent blue skin dimming in uneven pulses, her breath slowing as her body failed to regulate the cold. This was not how a scientist of the High Accord was meant to die. Alone, unseen, on a backwater planet populated by a species she had personally labeled inefficient. She tried to stand, but her legs refused, neural signals stuttering into nothing. And for a moment she considered activating her final protocol, shut down with dignity, until she heard it. A dull metallic clang followed by a human voice, low, casual, completely out of place in the dead silence. Ethan Cole didn't look like anything special, just a man in a worn utility jacket, gloves patched with tape, a portable heater slung over one shoulder, and a toolkit hanging from his belt like it had been there his whole life. He muttered to himself as he approached the wreck, boots crunching against frozen sand that had turned to glass under stress. His breath visible in short bursts as he scanned the damage like he was reading a language only he understood. When he saw her, he stopped, not in fear, not in awe, just in quiet assessment. Lyra raised what little strength she had left and aimed her failing sidearm at his chest, her voice thin but sharp. "Stay back, primitive." The translator barely holding together the words. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't raise his hands, didn't even look offended. He just tilted his head slightly like he was considering a problem, then crouched down a few feet away. Careful, measured. "You're gonna freeze out here," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She tightened her grip, or tried to. "Your species lacks the capacity to assist me," she replied, each word colder than the air around them. Ethan glanced at the weapon, then back at her, then at the cracked hull behind her, calculating. Always calculating. And then he did something her entire training had no framework for. He set his heater on the ground and slid it toward her, slowly, deliberately, like approaching a frightened animal. Warm air spilled into the frozen space between them, brushing against her failing skin, sending a shock through her system that made her gasp despite herself. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe." And then he leaned back on his heels, keeping his distance. "But you still look like you could use the help." The heat should not have mattered, not to her, not to a body engineered to endure extremes. Yet Lyra felt it seep into her like something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to relief, and that alone unsettled her more than the cold ever could. Her fingers twitched as the failing weapon slipped slightly in her grip, not lowered but no longer steady, and she hated that he noticed, hated more that he said nothing about it, just adjusted the small heater with a quiet click until the output steadied into a low hum that filled the silence between them. Ethan watched her the way he watched broken systems, not as a threat, but as something that could fail if handled wrong, and that realization crawled under her skin in ways she could not categorize. "Your suit is shot," he said after a moment, nodding toward the faint flicker of her biointerface. "And whatever keeps you warm is not doing its job." His voice was calm, almost conversational, like they were discussing weather instead of survival. Lyra forced her posture straighter, ignoring the way her vision blurred at the edges. "I require no intervention from you," she replied. But the words came slower now, heavier, as if her body was no longer fully cooperating with her authority. Ethan let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, but stopped short of disrespect. "That is fine," he said. "You do not have to want help for it to be useful." And before she could respond, he reached to his belt and pulled free a small tool, its light flickering on as he angled it toward the torn edge of her suit, stopping just short of crossing into her space. He waited, not for permission exactly, but for resistance, and when none came, when she realized she did not have the strength left to enforce it, he moved carefully. Precise, sealing a fracture in the material with practiced efficiency. The contact was minimal, almost non-existent, yet she felt it anyway. The proximity, the intention, Something in the way he worked that was not driven by protocol or command but by choice. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could reframe it into something sharper, something less revealing. Ethan shrugged slightly. "I still focused on the repair. Because it is there," he said then. After a second, "And because you are still breathing." As if that was explanation enough, Lyra searched for the logic in that answer and found none. No exchange, no hierarchy, no benefit, just a statement that refused to fit into any model she had studied. Her people would have measured worth, calculated outcome, determined value before action, but this human had already acted, already committed resources, already risked proximity without knowing who she was. The wind shifted outside, sending a low whistle through the broken hull behind her, and for a moment the cold pushed back against the fragile warmth between them, reminding her how quickly this could end. Her internal systems flickered again, dimming the faint glow of her skin, and this time she could not hide it. Ethan noticed immediately, his expression tightening just enough to register concern before he masked it again. "You are fading," he said quietly, not as an accusation, not as an observation, but as a problem he intended to solve. Lyra wanted to deny it, to reassert control, but the words did not come, and in that silence something shifted, something small but irreversible, as the space between them stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like a decision she had not yet admitted she was making. "You are fading," he had said, and the words lingered longer than they should have, echoing in the quiet space between failing systems and the steady hum of borrowed heat. Lyra felt it now with undeniable clarity, the slow dimming of her internal processes, the subtle delay between thought and response, like a signal traveling too far through damaged circuitry. She had studied collapse before, mapped it across lesser species, categorized the stages with clinical precision, but experiencing it from within was something else entirely, something uncomfortably human in its gradual loss of control. Ethan shifted slightly, the soft scrape of his boots against the frozen surface grounding the moment. And then he did something unexpected again. He sat down, not across from her like an observer, but beside the heater, positioning himself between her and the worst of the wind that whispered through the fractured hull behind them. It was not dramatic, not announced, just a small adjustment that changed the flow of cold air, and she felt the difference immediately. "You should not be here," she said, her voice quieter now, less edged with authority and more weighted with something she could not quite name. He glanced at her, then at the horizon where the pale light of a distant star barely touched the frozen landscape. "This is my job," he replied. "Things break out here. I fix them." And there was no irony in his tone, no attempt to elevate what he did into something greater. Lyra studied him then, really studied him, not as a subject, not as a classification, but as a presence. The way his hands moved with quiet confidence over damaged materials. The way he conserved energy without thinking. The way his breathing stayed steady despite the cold pressing in from every direction. Her data had described humans as inefficient, unpredictable, driven by emotion rather than logic. Yet everything she was witnessing contradicted that in subtle ways that her training could not easily dismiss. "You are not optimizing your survival probability," she said after a moment, the familiar structure of analysis slipping back into her voice. "Remaining here increases your risk significantly." Ethan let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and rubbed his hands together briefly before holding them closer to the heater. "Yeah," he said, "probably." And then he looked at her again, not dismissive, not defensive, just honest. "But leaving you out here would not sit right." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any complex reasoning could have, because there was no measurable gain in that decision, no strategic advantage, only a choice made on something she could not quantify. Her system flickered again, a sharper dip this time, and her body responded with a brief, involuntary shiver that she could not suppress. Ethan noticed instantly, his attention snapping back to her condition. "Stay with me," he said, the words coming out firmer now, carrying a weight that felt different from his earlier calm. "Whatever keeps you going, do that." Lyra almost responded with a correction, almost pointed out that her systems did not function on willpower or suggestion, but the effort to form the words faltered, and instead she found herself focusing on the one constant in the chaos around her, the steady presence of a human who refused to leave. For the first time since the crash, the question forming in her mind was not about survival, not about protocol or extraction, but about him. About why a species she had dismissed so easily could stand in the face of a failing world and choose to stay. And that question, more than the cold, more than the damage, unsettled her in a way she had never experienced before. The wind shifted again, a long hollow sound threading through the broken hull like something alive, and this time Ethan did not ignore it. He turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the horizon out of habit more than urgency, then reached back to adjust the angle of the heater once more, squeezing every bit of warmth into the narrow pocket where Lyra sat. It was inefficient, she noted automatically. The energy output versus environmental loss did not justify the configuration, and yet the effect was undeniable, the heat lingering longer, wrapping closer, buying her time she should not have had. "You are compensating manually," she said, the observation slipping out through the haze. "Your system lacks adaptive regulation." Ethan gave a small shrug, like the critique did not matter. "Yeah, well, it still works," he replied, tapping the side of the unit lightly. And there was something in that gesture, something almost familiar, like he trusted it not because it was perfect, but because he understood it. Lyra's vision flickered again, the edges dimming. But this time she forced her focus to remain on him, on the way he existed in this environment without the layers of enhancement her kind depended on. "Your physiology should not tolerate this temperature," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your survival parameters are limited." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling a thin cloud into the air. "Yeah, it is not exactly comfortable," he admitted, "but you get used to working through it." And again, there it was, that same pattern, not denial, not ignorance, but adaptation through persistence. Her data had never framed it that way. Humans were supposed to be reactive, inconsistent. Yet he was demonstrating a kind of quiet endurance that did not rely on superiority, only on refusal to stop. Another flicker hit her system, sharper this time, and the faint glow along her arms dimmed noticeably before struggling back. Ethan leaned forward immediately, concern no longer hidden. "Hey," he said, voice low but firm. "Stay with me. Do not shut down." Lyra almost corrected him again, almost explained that her systems did not respond to verbal instruction, but something in his tone interrupted that reflex, not authority, not command, but insistence, like he was speaking to something deeper than circuitry. She drew a slow breath, focusing on the heat, on the sound of his voice, on the steady rhythm of his presence, and for a moment, the decline stabilized. "Why?" she asked again, the question now heavier, more deliberate. "Why prioritize me?" Ethan did not answer immediately this time, his gaze drifting briefly to the fractured structure behind her, then to the endless, frozen stretch beyond, before returning to her. "Because I am here," he said finally, and the simplicity of it struck her harder than before, because it removed every variable she could analyze. No hierarchy, no classification, just presence and choice. The wind howled once more, stronger now, pushing a wave of cold through the gaps in the wreckage, and Ethan shifted again, this time closer, subtly, enough to block more of it without crossing into her space. His movements instinctive, uncalculated in the way her kind defined calculation. Lyra watched him through the fading light of her own systems and felt something unfamiliar settle beneath the confusion. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of a recalibration she had not authorized, a shift in understanding that her training could not suppress. For the first time, the concept of primitive felt incomplete, not incorrect yet, but insufficient. And that realization, quiet and persistent, began to reshape the way she saw the humans sitting beside her, not as a lesser form of intelligence, but as something her civilization had failed to fully comprehend. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty, but filled with the low hum of the heater and the faint, uneven rhythm of Lyra's failing systems. And Ethan could feel the change even without looking, the subtle way her breathing slowed, the way the glow along her skin dimmed just a fraction more than before. He shifted closer again, not enough to invade her space, just enough to keep the heat concentrated, his movements guided by instinct rather than calculation, the same instinct that had kept him alive on the edge of nowhere for longer than he cared to count. "Stay with me," he said again, quieter now, like he was speaking to something fragile that might slip away if he pushed too hard. And for a moment he wondered if that was exactly what was happening. Lyra heard him, or at least she processed the sound, but the meaning came slower, delayed by the growing distance between her thoughts and her body, and she found herself focusing not on the words, but on the tone, the steady insistence that refused to let her fade into silence. "Your persistence is inefficient," she managed, though the edge in her voice had dulled, replaced by something closer to observation than judgment. Ethan let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh if it had more energy behind it. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his hands together again before holding them near the heater. "I get that a lot." And then, after a pause, "Still works though." The same phrase, repeated, like a principle he lived by rather than something he said for effect. Lyra tried to analyze that, to place it within a framework that made sense, but the usual structures failed her. There was no optimization curve, no efficiency model that justified continued effort without guaranteed outcome. And yet he continued, not because it was logical, but because stopping was not an option he seemed willing to consider. Another flicker hit her, stronger this time, and the world tilted slightly, her vision narrowing until the edges blurred into darkness before slowly returning. Ethan leaned in immediately, concern no longer something he could hide behind calm. "Hey," he said, voice firm now, anchoring, "look at me." And it was not a command in the way her people used commands. It was a request backed by something deeper, something that carried weight without authority. Lyra forced her gaze toward him, the effort heavier than it should have been, and for a brief moment their eyes met, his steady and grounded, hers dimming but still searching, and in that contact something shifted again, something neither of them fully understood. "You are choosing this," she said slowly, each word deliberate. "There is no directive, no obligation." Ethan held her gaze, not challenging, not defensive, just present. "Yeah," he answered, "I am." And there was no hesitation, no attempt to justify it further, just a simple acknowledgement of choice. The wind howled again, louder now, pressing against the broken structure with a force that rattled loose fragments of metal. And Ethan glanced back briefly before returning his focus to her, recalculating in his own way, adjusting position, shifting the heater, doing everything he could with what little he had. Lyra watched him through the fading light of her systems and realized that this moment, did not fit into any model she had been trained to trust, because it was not about survival probability or hierarchical value. It was about something far less measurable and far more dangerous, the willingness to act without guarantee, to remain without reward, to care without reason. Her systems dipped again, the lowest yet, and for a fraction of a second everything went quiet, her senses pulling inward as if preparing to shut down. And in that narrowing space the last thing she registered was not the cold, not the damage, but the steady presence of a human who refused to leave. And for the first time since the crash, the thought that surfaced was not about how she would survive, but about what it meant that he stayed. For a moment, everything inside Lyra went quiet, not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that comes when systems begin to shut themselves down to preserve what little remained, her senses pulling inward, her thoughts slowing to distant echoes. And somewhere in that narrowing space, she understood that this was the edge. Ethan saw it before he fully understood it, the way her posture slackened just slightly, the way the faint glow along her skin dimmed to almost nothing, and something in his chest tightened with a sudden, sharp urgency that pushed past exhaustion and cold. "Hey," he said, louder now, not shouting but firm enough to cut through whatever distance she was drifting into. "Stay with me. Do not check out on me." And he leaned forward without thinking, one hand hovering just short of her shoulder, not touching, not yet, but close enough to anchor himself to the moment. Lyra heard the shift in his voice before she processed the words, the change from steady to urgent, and it pulled at something deep within her, something not tied to protocol or system function, but to awareness itself, a faint thread connecting her back to the external world. "Your concern is unnecessary," she tried to say, but the words came out fractured, uneven, As if even language was becoming too complex to maintain, Ethan exhaled sharply, a brief cloud of breath vanishing into the freezing air. "Yeah, I figured you would say that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Then he adjusted again, moving the heater even closer, sacrificing his own share of warmth without hesitation, the cold biting immediately into the space he left behind. Lyra registered that shift, the way the heat concentrated more fully around her, and the realization followed, slow but undeniable. He was giving up his own stability to preserve hers. That was not efficient, not logical, not something any system she had studied would recommend, and yet he did it without pause, without calculation, like it was the only option that existed. "Why reduce your own survival margin?" she asked, the question forming with effort. "This action degrades your position." Ethan shook his head slightly, a small, almost tired motion. "I am not running a calculation," he said quietly. "I am just not letting you freeze." And again, that same pattern, choice without equation, action without justification beyond the moment itself. The wind pushed harder against the broken structure, a low, constant pressure that made the metal groan softly, and Ethan glanced at it once before returning his full attention to her. Like nothing outside that small circle of heat mattered as much as the person in front of him. Lyra focused on him, forcing her fading perception to lock onto something stable, something real, and what she saw did not match the data she carried. There was no inefficiency in his intent, no randomness in his persistence, only a steady refusal to abandon a problem once it existed. Her systems flickered again, dipping dangerously low, and this time the darkness pressed in longer before receding, leaving behind a hollow sensation that felt less like function and more like absence. Ethan's hand moved slightly closer, still not touching, still respecting a boundary she had not explicitly lowered, but the hesitation in that motion carried its own meaning, a restraint that spoke louder than any direct action. "You are still here," he said, softer now, as if confirming it for himself as much as for her. "Good. Stay that way." And there was something in those words that resonated beyond logic, something that did not command but encouraged, did not demand but invited. Lyra held on to that, onto the sound of his voice, the warmth of the heater, the steady presence that refused to disappear. And for the first time, the fight to remain conscious did not feel like a mechanical process. It felt like a decision, fragile and unfamiliar, but undeniably hers. The cold did not ease. It never did on this world. It pressed in from every direction like a constant reminder that nothing here was meant to last. And yet within that narrow circle of warmth something fragile continued to hold. Lyra focused on that, on the steady hum of the heater, on the presence of the human beside her, and she began to understand that survival, in this moment, was no longer just a function of systems, but of attention, of what she chose to hold on to. Ethan shifted again. Slower now, conserving energy, his movements less frequent but more deliberate, like he was learning the rhythm of the situation and adapting without needing to think about it. His hands were beginning to stiffen from the cold. He could feel it in the way his fingers resisted when he flexed them, but he ignored it, just like he ignored the creeping numbness along his arms, because the problem in front of him was still unsolved. "You are stabilizing," Lyra said after a long pause, her voice faint but clearer than before, and the observation carried a hint of something new, not just analysis but recognition. Ethan glanced at her, a small nod acknowledging the change. "Good," he replied. "That means we bought some time." And there it was again, not relief, not celebration, just a quiet acceptance of progress, however small. Lyra processed that word, time, and realized how differently he treated it, not as something to measure and optimize, but as something to earn, moment by moment, through persistence. "Your method lacks predictive modeling," she said, though the edge of critique had softened into something closer to curiosity. "You operate without certainty." Ethan let out a faint breath, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly despite the cold. "Yeah," he said, "that is kind of how it goes out here." And then, after a second, "You fix what you can, and you deal with the rest when it shows up." And again, the simplicity of it resisted every framework she had been taught, because it did not try to eliminate uncertainty, it accepted it. The wind shifted again, carrying a sharper bite that slipped through the broken edges of the wreck. And Ethan instinctively leaned a little closer, not touching, still maintaining that careful distance, but enough to shield her from the worst of it, his body becoming part of the barrier between her and the environment. Lyra noticed that too. The way he placed himself without hesitation, and for the first time she did not interpret it as inefficiency, but as intention, a deliberate choice to absorb part of the burden. Her systems flickered again, but the drop was less severe this time, the stabilization holding, fragile but real, and she found herself focusing not on the failure signals, but on the pattern of his behavior, the consistency of his actions, the way he remained even as conditions worsened. "You adapt without directive," she said quietly. "There is no central command guiding your response." Ethan rubbed his hands together again, slower now, the motion more about maintaining function than comfort. "No," he said, "just experience." And then, almost as an afterthought, and a bit of stubbornness. The word lingered in the air, unfamiliar in its context, and Lyra searched for its equivalent in her own language, finding none that carried the same meaning. Stubbornness implied persistence beyond logic, continuation beyond reason, and yet here, in this moment, it was the only thing sustaining the situation. She looked at him again, really looked, past the worn gear, past the exposed limitations, and saw something her data had failed to capture. Not inefficiency, not randomness, but a kind of resilience that did not rely on superiority, only on refusal to stop. The realization settled slowly, reshaping the way she categorized him, and for the first time, the label she had assigned to his species felt not just incomplete, but fundamentally flawed, because it had never accounted for this, for the quiet, unyielding decision to remain when leaving would have been easier. The horizon shifted before either of them spoke about it, a faint distortion in the pale light where the sky met the frozen ground, subtle enough to miss if you were not already looking for change. But Ethan noticed, because noticing small things was how you stayed alive out here. His eyes narrowed slightly, tracking the movement, not alarmed yet, just aware, and then he glanced back at Lyra, weighing something silently. She followed his gaze, slower now, but more focused than before, her systems still fragile but holding, and she saw it too. The distant shimmer that did not belong to weather or terrain. "That is not environmental," she said quietly, her voice steadier than it had been, carrying a trace of the clarity she had been fighting to maintain. Ethan nodded once, shifting his weight, adjusting his position without pulling away from her. "Yeah," he said, "I figured." And there was no panic in him, just a recalibration, a subtle tightening of attention as he processed what it might mean. The heater hummed between them, its warmth now a constant presence, fragile against the growing tension in the air, and Lyra realized something in that moment, something that settled deeper than any data point. He had never stopped paying attention, not to her, not to the environment, not even for a second. Every movement, every adjustment, every word had been part of a continuous awareness that did not require systems to guide it. "Your behavior pattern," she began, then paused, recalculating her own language. "It is not random." Ethan gave a faint half smile, the expression small but genuine. "No," he said, "it is not." And then he looked back toward the horizon, just not the kind you are used to. The shimmer shifted again, slightly more defined now, and Lyra felt a different kind of awareness stir within her. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition, something familiar beneath the distortion that her systems struggled to fully interpret. Her internal interface flickered, attempting to lock onto the signal, and for a moment the glow along her skin pulsed faintly, stronger than before, reacting to something beyond the immediate environment. Ethan noticed that too, his attention snapping back to her. "Hey," he said, voice low but focused. "What is that?" Lyra drew a slow breath, the act still deliberate, still effortful, but more controlled than before. "It is aligned with my origin signatures," she said, the words coming clearer now, though still measured, not hostile, not yet. Ethan absorbed that, his expression tightening just slightly, not from fear but from the weight of decision, because whatever was coming would change the situation, and he knew it. The wind carried another low sound across the broken structure, blending with the distant distortion until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began, and Ethan shifted again, closer now than before, not by much, but enough that the space between them felt different, less like a boundary and more like something shared. Lyra noticed that too, the subtle shift, and for the first time she did not interpret it as a potential threat, but as a continuation of the same pattern she had been observing: protection without claim, presence without demand. If they arrive, she said slowly, they will not understand your actions. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. Yeah, he replied. I am not doing it for them. And there it was again, that same unyielding logic that did not fit into any system she had been trained to trust, because it was not built on recognition or reward, only on choice. The shimmer grew slightly brighter, more defined, and the air around them seemed to shift with it, subtle but undeniable, and Lyra felt her systems respond again, stabilizing just a fraction more, as if whatever was approaching carried a resonance she could not ignore. She looked at Ethan, really looked, and this time the question in her mind was no longer about why he stayed, but about what would happen when he no longer had to, and why the thought of that felt like something she was not prepared to face. The shimmer sharpened into structure, no longer a distortion but a presence pressing against the thin boundary of the atmosphere, and Ethan felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle change in pressure, the way the air seemed to hum at a frequency just beyond hearing. He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the forming shape, while his mind ran through possibilities he did not have the data to confirm. Lyra's systems reacted first, a faint surge rippling through her interface, stabilizing pathways that had been failing minutes before, and the glow along her skin returned in uneven pulses, stronger now, responding to something unmistakably familiar. They are here, she said, the words no longer strained, but still careful, as if she was measuring their weight. Ethan glanced at her, noting the change immediately, the steadiness in her voice, the return of control, and something in his chest eased, not fully, but enough to register the shift. That is good, right? He asked, not assuming, not projecting, just confirming. Lyra hesitated, not because she lacked the answer, but because the answer was no longer simple. It means survival probability increases, she said, then after a pause. But variables change. Ethan let out a quiet breath, eyes returning to the sky as the structure resolved further, angular lines cutting through the pale light, something advanced, precise, completely unlike anything he worked on. The heater hummed between them, its warmth still holding, but now it felt smaller against the scale of what was arriving, and yet he did not move away from it, did not pull back, as if abandoning that small circle would mean abandoning something more than just heat. Lyra watched him, the contrast striking in a way she could no longer ignore. Her people would have prioritized extraction immediately, would have shifted focus to command structures and recovery protocols, but Ethan remained where he was, anchored to the moment, to her, even as the situation evolved beyond his control. When they arrive, she said slowly, they will assess you as non-essential. Ethan nodded once, accepting the statement without resistance. Yeah, he replied, figured as much. And there was no bitterness in it, no attempt to argue against a system he was not part of, just acknowledgement. The structure above them grew clearer, a faint glow forming along its edges, and the ground beneath them seemed to respond, a low vibration that traveled through the frozen surface into the soles of Ethan's boots. Lyra felt it too, her systems aligning more rapidly now, the stabilization becoming more permanent, and with it came clarity, full awareness returning in waves. She looked at him again, not as a subject, not as an anomaly, but as the constant that had carried her through the gap between failure and recovery. You should leave, she said, the words precise, controlled, but carrying something beneath them that had not been there before. Your risk increases with their presence. Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze still on the descending shape, his posture unchanged, and when he finally spoke, it was quiet, steady. I am not going anywhere until I know you are good. And the statement landed with the same weight as before, simple, unadorned, but absolute. Lyra processed that, not as inefficiency, not as error, but as a decision that existed outside the structure she had relied on her entire life. And for the first time, she understood that this was the difference, not technology, not capability, but the willingness to remain without recognition, to act without being seen as necessary. The light from above intensified slightly, casting long, faint reflections across the frozen surface, and the air grew still, as if holding its breath. Lyra's systems reached full stabilization, her strength returning in measured increments. And with it came the ability to choose again, not just to survive, but to respond. She looked at Ethan, really looked. And the question forming in her mind was no longer about classification or survival, but about value, about what her people would see, and what they would fail to understand when they looked at the human who had stayed when no system told him to. The light did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly across the sky like something deliberate, controlled, casting long, precise shadows over the frozen ground as the descending craft stabilized above them, its presence vast yet eerily silent, as if even the air respected its authority. Ethan squinted slightly against the glow, one hand instinctively rising to shield his eyes, but he did not move away, did not step back, his position anchored beside the heater, beside her, as if that choice had already been made long before this moment. Lyra felt the shift completely now, her systems no longer struggling but aligning, every interface reconnecting with clarity that surged through her like returning breath. And with that clarity came something heavier, awareness not just of her own survival, but of what was about to happen next. The surface beneath them vibrated in a low, controlled pattern, not chaotic, not threatening, just precise, and a narrow column of light extended downward from the craft, stopping just short of the ground. Waiting. Extraction protocol, Lyra said quietly, her voice now fully stable, carrying the authority she had lost only moments before, but it did not sound the same. There was a hesitation threaded through it, something uncharacteristic. Ethan nodded once, taking that in, his gaze moving from the light to her, studying her face for the first time not as a problem to solve, but as someone who no longer needed him to stay. "That is your ride," he said, simple, almost casual, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, not disappointment, not relief, just acknowledgement that the situation had changed. Lyra looked at the beam of light, then back at him, and for the first time since her system stabilized, uncertainty moved through her thoughts, not because she did not understand what to do, but because she understood it too well. "They will not wait indefinitely," she said, as if stating a fact would simplify the choice. Ethan gave a small shrug, the motion slower now, fatigue settling deeper into his muscles as the cold he had ignored began to catch up with him. "Then you should not keep them waiting," he replied, and there it was again, that same pattern, placing the decision entirely in her hands, not asking for anything in return. The heater hummed between them, still working, still holding the fragile warmth that had bridged the gap between life and loss. And for a moment Lyra realized how small it was compared to the technology above them, how inefficient, how limited, and yet it had done what the advanced systems of her own craft had failed to do in time. It had kept her alive long enough for rescue to arrive. The beam of light pulsed once, brighter now, an unmistakable signal, and Lyra felt the pull of it through her interface, a connection to her people, her role, her place in a structure far larger than this isolated moment. She should have moved immediately, should have stepped into the light without hesitation, but she did not, because something else held her there, something that had no place in protocol or directive. She looked at Ethan again, really looked, and saw the cost written in the small details, the stiffness in his hands, the way his breath came a little slower now, the subtle tension in his posture as the cold pressed in on him. Again without the warmth he had given up. "You compromised your condition for mine," she said, the words precise, but carrying weight now, not as analysis, but as recognition. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his gaze drifting briefly to the horizon before returning to her. "Yeah," he said, seemed like the right call, and there was no attempt to make it sound heroic, no effort to elevate it beyond what it was, just a choice made and accepted. The light pulsed again, brighter, closer to a demand now, and Lyra felt the moment narrowing, the window for decision closing. But for the first time in her life, the correct action was not the easiest one to execute, because it required her to decide not just what she was, but what she believed about the human standing beside her. and whether that belief would follow her when she stepped back into the world she came from. The light pulsed again, sharper this time, no longer waiting but expecting, and Lyra felt it like a call embedded deep within her system architecture, a command that had been reinforced since the beginning of her training: return, report, resume function. It would have been effortless to obey. One step forward, and the beam would take her, lift her out of the cold, out of the uncertainty, back into a world where everything made sense again. But she did not move, and that single moment of stillness stretched longer than it should have, long enough for something else to surface, something that did not come from protocol or hierarchy, but from observation, from experience, from him. Ethan noticed it immediately, not the system signals, not the interface shifts, but the hesitation, the way she remained just outside the edge of the light, and he did not speak at first, did not interrupt the decision forming in her mind, because he understood that some choices could not be rushed. Without breaking something important, the cold pressed harder against him now, reclaiming the warmth he had given up, his fingers slower, his breath heavier, but he stayed where he was, not because he expected anything, but because leaving before the moment resolved felt wrong in a way he could not explain. "You are delaying," Lyra said finally, the words directed more at herself than at him, as if naming it would force the action to follow. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging the obvious. "Yeah," he said, "looks like it," and there was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, just quiet recognition. The beam of light intensified slightly, its edges sharpening, and for a second Lyra felt the full weight of what it represented, not just safety, but identity, the place she belonged, the system that defined her. She could step into it, and everything would continue as it was meant to. Her report would be filed, her classifications maintained, her conclusions unchanged. And yet, she knew that was no longer true, because what she had seen here could not be undone, could not be ignored. It had already altered the way she processed the world. She turned her head slowly, looking at Ethan again, taking in the details she had missed before, the wear on his equipment, the way he conserved movement, the quiet resilience in the way he held himself despite the cold. "If I leave," she said, her voice steady but quieter now, "this interaction will be evaluated." Ethan shrugged slightly, the motion minimal. "I figured," he replied, and then after a brief pause, "You do what you have got to do." And there it was again. The same pattern, releasing the outcome entirely, not asking for defense, not asking for recognition, just allowing her to choose. Lyra processed that, not as indifference, but as something far more complex, trust without demand, support without condition, and it disrupted every model she had relied on. The light pulsed again, brighter, closer to a final call, and her system flagged it accordingly, priority escalating, response required. She stepped forward, just one movement, enough to feel the edge of the beam brush against her, the familiar pull of her own technology. Recognizing her presence, ready to take her back, and then she stopped. Behind her, Ethan shifted slightly, not moving away, not stepping closer, just remaining exactly where he had been, as if that was the only position that made sense to him. Lyra stood there between two worlds, one defined by certainty, the other by something she could not fully name, and for the first time, the choice was not about survival or function. It was about meaning, about whether what she had learned here would follow her or be left behind. She turned back to him, the light casting a faint glow across both of them, and in that moment, the question was no longer what she would do, but who she would be when she did it. The light held steady, no longer pulsing, no longer urging, as if the decision had already been acknowledged before it was spoken, and Lyra felt the pull of it loosen just enough for something else to take its place. She stepped back out of the beam, the motion small but irreversible, and the connection to the craft shifted immediately, not severed, but waiting, recalibrating around her choice. Ethan noticed the movement before he fully processed it, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that something had changed in a way he had not expected. "You are not leaving," he said quietly. Not as a question, but as an observation. Lyra turned to face him fully now, the glow along her skin stabilizing into a steady, controlled light, her posture no longer that of someone recovering, but of someone deciding. "Not yet." she replied, and the words carried weight, not hesitation, but intention. Above them, the craft responded, the beam retracting slightly, its intensity lowering, and a new presence emerged from the light, not descending rapidly, not with force, but with deliberate precision, a figure outlined in the same soft glow, approaching without urgency. Lyra's gaze shifted upward for a moment, her expression tightening in a way that suggested familiarity mixed with something more complex. And then she looked back at Ethan, as if grounding herself before what came next. "They will assess this interaction," she said, her voice returning to its formal cadence. But there was something beneath it now, something that did not belong to protocol, and they will categorize you according to existing models. Ethan gave a faint shrug, the motion slower now, the cold clearly catching up to him. But his focus remained steady. "Yeah," he said, "that sounds about right." And there was no resistance in it. No attempt to argue against a system he did not belong to. Lyra studied him for a moment longer, then shifted her stance slightly, positioning herself between him and the descending figure. Not aggressively, not defensively, but deliberately, a placement that altered the dynamic in a way that could not be ignored. The figure reached the ground with a soft, controlled motion, its presence precise, composed, and undeniably advanced, its attention immediately locking onto Lyra before shifting briefly toward Ethan, assessing, measuring, categorizing in a fraction of a second. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structured, filled with unspoken evaluation. And Lyra felt it clearly, the weight of expectation, the assumption of compliance. "Report," the figure said, its voice calm, neutral, carrying authority without raising volume. Lyra did not respond immediately, and that pause, that single break in expected timing, carried more significance than any direct refusal. Ethan remained still behind her, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply present, as he had been from the beginning. Lyra drew a slow breath, her systems fully aligned now, her thoughts clear, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, controlled, but different, shaped by something that had not existed before this moment. "Correction required," she said, the words precise, deliberate. "Previous classification parameters for human subjects are incomplete." The figure remained still, its attention sharpening, processing the deviation, and Lyra continued without hesitation. "Observed behavior demonstrates adaptive persistence, non-transactional assistance, and decision-making independent of hierarchical directive." Each phrase measured, each one a shift, away from the framework she had once enforced. Ethan listened without fully understanding the structure of what she was saying, but he understood the tone, the intent behind it, and something in his chest settled, not relief, not pride, just recognition that she was choosing something that mattered to her. The figure's gaze shifted again toward Ethan, reassessing, recalculating, and for the first time, there was a pause in that process, a fraction of a second where the existing model did not fully apply. Lyra held her position, not moving aside, not yielding the space she had chosen, and in that moment, the decision she had made was no longer internal. It was visible, undeniable, and it changed the way both worlds would see what stood between them. The silence after her statement did not feel empty. It felt measured, like the universe itself had paused to process a deviation it had not been designed to expect. And for a moment nothing moved, not the figure before her, not the light above, not even the wind that had howled across the frozen surface only minutes before. Ethan stood where he had always been, just outside the edge of everything, his breath slow, his body still, watching without stepping in, because this was no longer his moment to act, only to witness. The figure's gaze remained fixed on Lyra, its posture unchanged, but something in the stillness shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, a recalibration taking place beneath a surface built on certainty. "Clarify," it said finally, the single word precise, controlled, but carrying a weight that acknowledged the break in expectation. Lyra did not hesitate this time, her voice steady, grounded not in protocol, but in something she had chosen. "Human classification as primitive is inaccurate," she said, each word deliberate. "Observed behavior demonstrates complexity beyond current models, specifically in autonomous ethical decision-making and sustained action without directive, or incentive. The terms were familiar, structured, but the meaning behind them had changed, shaped by experience rather than assumption. The figure processed this, its attention shifting once more toward Ethan, and this time the assessment lingered, not dismissive, not immediate, but incomplete, as if the framework it relied on had encountered something it could not fully resolve. Ethan met that gaze without reaction, not challenging it, not lowering his own, just standing as he was. The same man who had fixed broken systems and shared heat without asking for anything in return. Lyra remained where she stood, between them, not as a barrier, but as a bridge, her presence redefining the space itself. Your conclusion deviates from established doctrine, the figure said, and while the tone remained neutral, there was a subtle shift beneath it, something closer to acknowledgement than correction. Lyra inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in confirmation. Then the doctrine is incomplete, she replied. And there was no hesitation in her voice now, no trace of the uncertainty that had once defined her. The light above them softened, its intensity lowering as if the system had accepted the delay, the deviation, the change. The moment stretched, not tense, not urgent, but full, like something had settled into place that had not existed before. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension he had not fully acknowledged easing just enough to register, and he glanced at Lyra, not expecting anything, not asking for recognition, just seeing her as she was now, no longer someone he needed to keep alive, but someone who had chosen something he did not fully understand, but respected all the same. Lyra turned to him, and for a second the world narrowed again, not because of failing systems, but because of clarity, because she understood what this moment was, not an ending, not a transaction, but a point where two paths touched and then moved forward. You stayed, she said quietly, the words simple, but carrying everything that had happened between them. Ethan gave a small nod, the motion almost instinctive. Yeah, he said, you needed it. And there was nothing more to it than that. No claim, no expectation, just truth. The figure stepped back slightly, the light responding in kind, opening once more, waiting, but no longer demanding. Lyra looked at it, then back at Ethan, and this time when she stepped forward, it was not to escape, not to return to what she had been, but to carry something with her that could not be erased. She paused at the edge of the light, just long enough to look back one last time, and there was no formal acknowledgement, no gesture defined by protocol, just a quiet moment where understanding existed without words. Then she stepped into the beam, and the light lifted her away, smooth and silent, leaving the frozen world exactly as it had been, except for one thing. Ethan remained, the heater still humming beside him, the cold already pressing back in, but he did not move right away, because something about the silence felt different now, not empty, not harsh, just still, and far above. In a system built on logic and certainty, a single line of data was rewritten, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, and somewhere within it, a simple truth remained, unmeasured, uncontained, and impossible to ignore, that sometimes the smallest choice, made without reason, could change the way an entire universe understood what it meant to be human.